let me tell you, when Google wants to know anything about Formula One, they actually look up Matt Bishop. I'm not even kidding you. That's how it goes. Journalist, broadcaster, communications manager, back in the paddock again with Aston Martin Cognizant Formula One team as the chief communication officer. Such a privilege, Matt. Thanks so much for joining us here on the F1 Pit Box.
I'm honoured to join you.
It's great to have you, Matt. We've all got a story about how we fell in love with motorsport and motor racing. Where did yours start from, and specifically into the world of Formula One?
How I fell in love with Formula One is a bit of a mystery because my mum and dad had no interest in Formula One. No one in my family had any interest in motorsport whatsoever. And I used to be a big football fan as a kid, as you know, soccer, as a lot of British boys are and girls nowadays. And I used to, with my pocket money, I used to buy a magazine called Shoot, which was a football, soccer magazine for kids. It doesn't exist anymore. Great. If you ever want to go down a nostalgic trip down memory lane for football fans, go and buy some nice old copies of Shoot on eBay. Anyway, that was my pocket money. And then I saw this magazine called Autosport. I saw it on the newsagent's counter. And I said to the newsagent, "What is that? What is that?" Because you have to remember that motor racing, Formula One, wasn't really even on television. I was born in 1962, and probably the date I'm talking about is probably 1972. I was probably about 10. And I saw this copy of a magazine called Autosport with a blue car with open wheels and just one driver sitting in the middle with his helmet sticking out of the top. And you can guess who that was. It was Jackie Stewart.
There we go.
Now Sir Jackie Stewart.
In the Tyrrell.
In the Tyrrell. Beautiful car, successful car. And I said, "Can I have that instead of Shoot?" And I think it was 2 pence more. So I had to pay another 2 pence or something. But anyway, I've never looked back. And I probably haven't really, to be honest, I probably haven't really missed a copy of Autosport since that time, which is, you know, nearly 50 years ago. And I've written in quite a few of them as well.
Yeah, I know a lot of people know you from that, and we'll get into F1 racing. But before we go on, in the background, there is a stunning helmet on your wall. Tell us a little bit about that first.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, I've been in Formula One and motor racing for a long, long time. And I don't fool myself that the people with whom I have worked necessarily constitute real friends, other than the fact that I would say I am friendly with quite a few of them. You know, I'm friendly with Lewis Hamilton. I wouldn't dream of claiming him as an actual friend. But the person who gave me that helmet is an actual friend, a real bosom pal, and that's Alex Wurz. And I had a big birthday party, my 50th birthday party, which is 8 and a bit years ago. And he turned up with a helmet bag. And I thought, wife, Julia, and I thought, my birthday's in December. I thought, what on earth could he be testing or racing in England? Why has he got a helmet bag? I said, why have you got a helmet bag, mate? He said, no, that's your 50th birthday present. It's the helmet that I wore to win the Le Mans 24 hours race for the second time for Peugeot in 2009. And I must admit, I was a bit choked because it's such a generous gift, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's something very serious. I mean, speaking of Alex Wurz, I actually read Julia's book, and I found it quite entertaining, I must say as well. Yeah.
Well, she's a great woman, by the way. They're a great couple, great family, 3 lovely kids, and you know, the Wurzes, you know, wonderful, lovely people. And Alex is my best friend, really, in the sport.
Magic to hear. Magic to hear. You mentioned Autosport, and then F1 racing came along. For us here in South Africa, we would get Autosport, but we'd most probably be a couple of months behind until the whole digital world changed those kind of things. But then all of a sudden, there was this magazine, F1 Racing. And, Autosport covered everything in terms of motorsport, but F1 Racing was dedicated very much to just for Formula One. And all of a sudden, it sparked a tremendous interest. I mean, I was looking everywhere for information on Formula One. And now all of a sudden, I had a new Bible. How did you fall into that and become the editor and turn it into the most successful Formula One magazine ever?
Well, I mean, it's a very kind question. I was a motoring journalist for Car magazine, not necessarily the most inspirational or original title for a car magazine, but nonetheless a successful one. And I was, the normal things that you would do. I was a road tester. I wrote news about road cars and new cars and so on and so forth. And I enjoyed, ragging Porsches and Ferraris and Aston Martins and things, as you would as a young man. And I enjoyed the writing. And by the way, Car Magazine is still going, great magazine. But I also, at that time, obviously had a burning passion for Formula One. And the then editor, Gavin Green, who's still a mate, Australian, he had a passion for Formula One as well, and had been a racing driver in his youth in Australia, Formula Ford, and then had done tin top saloons in the UK. And reasonable success at Spa 24 hours, that kind of level of racing. So Gavin, good driver. And I said, look, can we up the content on Formula One a little bit? I'll still do I'll still road test the Toyota Corolla if you want. I'll still road test the Porsche 911 if you want. But let's do a little bit more motor racing, and particularly Formula One. And he said yes. And so I began to go to the odd race. But we're talking about the early 90s now. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't there full time in Formula One, but I'd start going to, a few races every year. And then the people who were publishing Autosport at the time, which is a company called Haymarket, still exists, but doesn't publish Autosport anymore. They were looking to start a monthly magazine, a monthly version of Autosport, I think is what they first envisaged it as. But then they realized that it should be Formula One only. And they kicked it off with a small skeleton staff of Autosport youngsters. Yeah. The editor was Mike Hurd, the son of Robin Hurd, obviously famous of March and McLaren fame, not with us anymore, great Formula One designer. And other people, Tom Clarkson, for instance, who's still well known, very well known now as the podcaster official for Formula One. He was 21 then, a young lad. And the magazine went for about it was a monthly, it went for about 6 months. And then Mike Hurd said he wanted to move on out of motorsport and had never really wanted to be the full-time editor of F1 Racing. He went to news journalism, The Guardian, newspaper in the UK. And I was asked to come and edit it, and I jumped at the chance. And I edited it for 11 years. And during the course of the time that I was editor, this obviously achievement, not as a result of only my travails, but those of also my superb team, brilliant people. I've mentioned Tom Clarkson. I should also mention Darren Heath, brilliant photographer.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Unbelievable photographer. And the magazine, as a result, looked so good. There are too many to mention. But, Peter Windsor, great writer. The late Alan Henry, who lovely man, no longer with us, great writer as well. And we decided that we weren't going to just report on the races, because everybody who had bought a monthly magazine, of course, they'd already watched the races. They'd already heard the dulcet, famous tones of Murray Walker describing what had happened on their television sets. So we tried to bring out the characters of the drivers. And I happen to have the June 2002 edition in front of me, and I will show you. So there you are. That is the kind of image that we used to get the drivers to adopt. because we wanted to show the characters, and I think you can see that that does show the character of that great driver, Juan Pablo Montoya, who I personally think is one of the most talented drivers never to win the Formula One World Championship, but he's won almost everything else, and of course did win 7 Grand Prix.
Yeah, no, I endorse that completely. And I mean, I'm so grateful that you showed that kind of a picture, because that was the one thing about F1 racing. I mean, I was a subscriber, and I would just anxiously wait for the 24th or 25th of the month. And in those early 2000s and even 90s, our postal system was a lot better, so things used to arrive on time, which was amazing. But that the one thing that I so loved about it, and as you mentioned, the races have gone, you managed to bring, fans like myself and others, more of an insight into the characters of Formula One, of the mechanics of how Formula One worked. Because as we know, for many, many years, and still even today, it is very much a closed little environment, Matt. But Formula One racing, gave us something of a different insight into the sport, as opposed to, and with the greatest respect, to an auto sport who just sat there and said, well, on lap 7, Michael Schumacher, went wide and Montoya went through, etc., etc. And I found that really, really fascinating. And kudos to you and your whole team, because it was something that when I was talking to my colleagues about Formula One, I would pick on all of the wonderful writings of you and your team. So I mean, it was a fabulous, fabulous time.
Well, thank you. I mean, as I say, really, the team I hired were a brilliant team, and it was very, I was flattered by being their colleague and their editor, because they did such a great job. I mean, I'm going to show you one other double-page spread here. So I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, the 360.
Now that is obviously it's a Ferrari 360, well spotted, and the driver is. I'm looking a bit silly with my head sticking up over the top of it, but there we go. Anyway, the driver is Rubens Barrichello, and in the passenger seat is Tom Clarkson, who was, as I said, one of our star writers, and still now a star journalist in the sport. And that was the kind of access we got. We said, look, we want to interview Rubens Barrichello, who of course was a leading driver of the time, winning races, mostly having to trot along behind Michael Schumacher, but sometimes being permitted to win races. And you have to remember that's 2022, one of the most dominant seasons of all time.
Yeah, let's not talk Austria, but that's fine.
Okay. Anyway, this was I think that feature was done earlier in the year, around the San Marino Grand Prix, and we said, look, we will feature your road car 360, but we have to have an interview, we have to have exclusive, and Tom and Rubens got in the car together. And the good thing about that kind of thing was nobody had really done that kind of feature until then. It had usually just been news and reports.
Yeah.
And we were trying to do a lifestyle approach. And of course, there was no social media, there was no Instagram, there was nothing like that. So that really fans had no way of gaining any proximity or insight into their heroes other than what we were developing. And so, when I started at F1 racing in 1996, it was in one language, English, on sale in one country, the UK. By the time I left to join McLaren, which I'm sure you'll ask me about, which was 11 years later, it was on sale in 34 languages in 110 countries. And that was really, I mean, that's a pre-digital proliferation, if you like. And the magazine could never do that now because Instagram does the job.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I have so many fond memories. You bring up McLaren. There you are working, highly, highly respected people. You've grown this magazine. All of a sudden, McLaren find themselves in a incredibly difficult position with what happened with Stepney and Coughlin and you just name them, which became known as the McLaren Gate. And all of a sudden, Matt, you get a phone call from the mighty Ron Dennis. You're a communications expert, you're a superb writer, and he says, listen, I've got a colossal cock up over here. Would you be prepared to come and assist me? I do hope, firstly, it was a pretty decent check, and secondly, I'm hoping that he sat there and said, Matt, I know that you can do this job. It must have been a terrifying time.
Well, first of all, I'll correct you, because anyone who knows Ron Dennis well knows that he speaks Ron speak, and colossal cock-up is not in the lexicon. He would have said a significantly suboptimal occurrence. Or something like that.
Thank you for correcting me. Yes, a Ronism.
Right. Yeah, no worries. So, yeah, I got to know Ron for my sins, and I'd done a lot of interviews with him. And although we're very different people in very many ways, for some reason he warmed to me. I think he liked. I mean, I've always tried hard to write well and to imbue my writing not just with hopefully interesting insights. I mean, I may often get this wrong. I'm not trying to be at all conceited, because there are many far better writers both in the sport and not in the sport, obviously, than I. But I did try hard, and I tried to make all of our in F1 racing, I tried to make it, if you like, literary. You know, I wanted wordsmiths. I wanted people to, and so I wanted the pictures to look good, the design to look good, and I wanted the words to read well. And I think Ron appreciated all of that, attention to detail, his famous attention to detail. It's one of the strange things about some of the grandees of our sport, then and now, is this astonishing attention to detail. You know, Ron Dennis had it, Bernie Ecclestone had it. Nowadays, you know, Toto Wolff has it. My boss, Lawrence Stroll, has it. I mean, absolute meticulous attention to detail. Yeah, everything has to be just so. So he liked the fact that our magazine looked good and read well and so on. And we got to know each other, and we started having the odd dinner as well as interviews. And Ron can be very generous, you know, good wine, sometimes extremely good wine. Anyway, he first offered me a job at the 2001 French Grand Prix in Magny-Cours, but it wasn't the right job. To be honest, as you hinted, it wasn't the right money. And I wasn't finished with F1 racing yet. I'd only been there 5 years as editor, and I wanted to do more. And I knew we could continue to make progress with the magazine, and we did. But then when what you called McLaren Gate, but what it was usually called Spygate, at the time, and sometimes even Stepney Gate, again, God rest him, no longer with us, but Spygate is the name that has stuck. And Ron was in a significantly suboptimal situation, to use one of his favorite Ron speak terms. And he rang me, it was in Turkey, the Istanbul paddock, and he rang me in 2007 and said, could you come to see me in my motorhome, the big McLaren brand center as it was known. So I went to see him, and he offered me a job. He said, I really do need you to take this job. He needed someone who knew the paddock, knew the politics, knew the FIA, knew Max Mosley, knew Bernie Ecclestone, knew what made them tick, understood the Formula One media core, and he also needed someone he knew. He didn't want to get to know somebody, try to feel that he could trust such a person. Ron has trust issues, and like a lot of people do, and there's nothing wrong with that, but he did know me by that time, and I think he felt able to trust me, so he hired me. And since I was in this rather luckily unique position of being the only person that he knew and trusted and had the skill set, yes, in answer to your question, I did name quite a high price.
Good for you.
And it was, he was so, his situation was so suboptimal at the time. And having just been fined $100 million, what did it matter? You know, he wasn't going to argue the odd few grand out of me, but it set me up okay. It was a significant pay rise. And I went to the dark side, abandoned journalism, but not writing. You might want to ask me about that later. I've written a novel quite recently. But I immersed myself in comms, and it was obviously very difficult to start with because the
Yes.
team was not on its knees, but very, very, all the personnel were disheartened. And I characterized when I arrived in early 2008, because I had to do some gardening leave from F1 racing. I would just say that my colleagues were characterized by a sense and a feeling of defensive pessimism, having just been fined $100 million, having just had their Constructors' Championship victory taken away, because although the two drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, were allowed to keep their points, and they finished second and third, as you know, Kimi Raikkonen won the World Championship for Ferrari. Actually, McLaren had scored more points than Ferrari that year. Correct. And would have been Constructors' champion. So very, very difficult situation to come into.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, you know, the $100 million. I mean, I remember when Max Mosley announced it, it was wow. I mean, that's a serious, serious amount of money. But then, of course, you lose all of your constructors' points, which means you lose all of your television money. So, I mean, it was a substantial, substantial hit. Yet, incredibly, you managed to, through your communication skills through McLaren, you know, is to ease the waters. To, you know, everyone's a gossiper in the world of Formula One, and then they'll try and hype them up, and wherever there's a little bit of smoke, they'll try and turn it into a fire. But it was quite amazing. What I was quite amazed is how you managed to get everyone to sit there and say, hey, that's the fine. We take accountability for it. We're not even going to try and argue regardless. And there could have been a million different kinds of arguments. It was just sort of bang, we'll take it. And sure, following year, you had a world champion and you were right at the top again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point. I think in 2007, before I got there, there was quite a lot of, you know, equivocation and from McLaren. Is McLaren going to challenge this fine? Is it going to appeal, hold its hands up, etc.? You know, there is a good book which may one day be written. I don't mean by me, though. Who knows in the future? But there is a good book that could be written by somebody now about what actually happened in Spygate, because the truth of it hasn't really come out yet. But I'm not going to get into that now. What I would say is that at that point, the best thing to do was to draw a line under it and say, okay, that has happened. We have survived. This is a wonderful team with two wonderful drivers. So if I can characterize the mood of my colleagues when I arrived in 2008, because I had to do some garden leave at the end of my F1 racing time, I would say defensive pessimism, $100 million fine. But the team had survived. And we drew a line. We decided to draw a line under what had happened before. And we decided to make the team a little bit more approachable and friendly, because it could have been depicted and perceived as austere, which is actually one of Ron Dennis's, if you like, shortcomings. I mean, he's a great guy, fantastic guy, but and a complete legend of the sport, but he is a bit brittle in his character at times. And that came over in the brand, if you like. So I'll just give you one example. The big brand center, the big austere, reflective black glass building in the paddock, it used to have a sign on the door saying VIPs and invited guests only. We changed that and replaced it with one word, welcome. And I think that was indicative of the kind of changes we were trying to make. And then, of course, we had Lewis Hamilton. We'd had him the year before, but we had Lewis Hamilton, you know, by anyone's measure, one of the greatest drivers now in the history of motor racing. But we didn't know that then. We just knew he was extremely talented. And what did he go and do? He went and won the World Championship in the most extraordinary way that we have ever seen. On the last corner of the last lap of the last race. And I was in the garage on that day, and I can hardly talk about it without the little hairs on the back of my neck. I won't say that the hairs on my head, because I haven't got any of them, but the little hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was a truly extraordinary year, it was an truly extraordinary race, and it was an truly extraordinary moment when he overtook Timo Glock to be champion.
It was, and I think it also just characterized what we were going to see of Lewis Hamilton. I mean, it could have worked negatively in his favor the year before, him and Fernando fighting. Had he lost another one, things could have been so completely different. But I mean, I remember watching on the television, and being an Italian, I was maybe a little bit more partial towards the red car, but just seeing what happened, you just knew there was greatness, and you knew it from the beginning of 2007 with Lewis entering into the sport. Matt, you then took,
Can I just say something? I'll just say
yeah,
something on that. Sorry, just because you mentioned obviously being Italian, and obviously in those days, Formula One was really McLaren versus Ferrari. That was,
yeah,
by and large, that was the narrative. Not always. Obviously, there were other people that came in and so on. There was Renault, there was Benetton, there was Williams, obviously, all the time before that. But at that period, it was McLaren versus Ferrari. And I just want to say, pay tribute to Felipe Massa that day. Felipe Massa had won his home race in front of his home crowd. He had driven brilliantly. As he crossed the line, he thought he had won the World Championship. And so, as you've seen the famous footage, did the people in the Ferrari garage, including his father, punching the air, delirious with joy. And then somebody said, hang on a minute, look, Lewis has got past Glock. And the faces of slow realization on the faces of Felipe's father and the other people close to him is watch it now, and you still see it's human frailty in the raw. And although I was triumphant and delighted, I still feel sorry for them. And then Felipe Massa on the podium with his beating his chest like that, tears pouring down his face. And I've actually spoken to him since. I didn't speak to him for years afterwards, but I found, because obviously he was a Ferrari driver and then drove for other teams, and I was working for McLaren. But I found myself sitting next to him on a plane from London. Actually, it wasn't from London. It was a Finnair flight to Tokyo, and it was London, Helsinki, Tokyo for the Japanese Grand Prix. And when I got onto the second leg at Helsinki, it so happened that my seat was next to Felipe Massa's seat. So we sat down. We hadn't spoken for a while, obviously, and we began to talk about that. And I said, I just want to say how impressed I was with the way you handled yourself. And he said, I would have found it difficult, very difficult, had I not done everything I could, because I won the race. If I'd finished second, I'd feel maybe I left something on the table. But I won my home Grand Prix. And okay, 40 seconds a minute behind me, finally Lewis managed to overtake Glock. It was a blow at the time, a real blow, but I did everything I could.
Yeah, it reminds me of the early days of Prost also having to do that and also losing a championship. But his demeanor was admirable, very, very admirable.
And he came and shook hands with Lewis Hamilton and congratulated him, and I was there to see it. And no, I've got a lot of time for Felipe. Sorry, I keep interrupting you. Off you go.
No, not at all. Matt, I want to move on a little bit. You took a bit of a hiatus, a bit of a sabbatical from the world of Formula One. And then I must say, to great delight, all of a sudden, Aston Martin, the brand, the name coming back into Formula One, proper ownership, stability, and I think that's what a lot of Formula One teams really strive for. There's a lot that we all know struggle along. That will hopefully change in the near future. What tempted you to go back into that paddock life, the incredible amount of traveling again? Being British, of course, the Aston Martin brand must have some kind of an appeal. But what was it that that phone call, that came and said, listen, we'd like you to come and head up our communications at Aston Martin? How did that come about, and what was your feeling?
Well, I'd had about 3 years out. I worked for W Series, which you didn't mention, but I was
Ah,
one of the founders of W Series, which is obviously single-seater racing for women drivers,
yeah.
and which will be racing alongside Formula One at 8 races this year, but started in 2009 with 6 standalone races on the DTM platform. And a very small number of people were involved. It was David Coulthard who got me into that. And I'm an evangelist for W Series, and I wish it well.
And sorry,
Clara, and I decided I wanted to write a novel. So maybe,
yeah, sorry, just to interrupt there. I mean, listen,
sorry?
we love the W series, and of course we've had a couple of our South Africans, and in this new series we've still got Tasman Pepper as well. So believe you me, we are so excited to see them as the sort of precursor to the big races. Carry on.
Well, Tasmin Pepper is a great woman, really. I'm very fond of her. Obviously, South African. I think that she could do well. By her own admission, she probably needs to work on her qualifying, but her racing is very strong. If she could qualify a bit better, then she could, her racing is already there. Her race pace is already there. So if she can work on that, I think she could be successful this year. She was already quite successful, by the way, in 2019, but I think she could be nearer the front. If she qualifies well, she can race well. I also wrote a novel in the time off. Do you want to ask me about that now? We can talk about that later, or shall we talk about it now?
I think let's talk about it now because I think this is also quite.
Okay, well, here we are. Here it is then. The boy. Okay. Okay. So it's The Boy Made the Difference. It's got nothing to do with Formula One or motor racing. I'm a gay man. When I arrived in Formula One, I was the only gay in the village. Not that we had that phrase at the time, the British comedy series Little Britain, but I was the only gay in the village. And perhaps it was a surprise to people. But anyway, I was. And I gradually got to know people and found my feet and was accepted and have formed firm friendships with the very much predominantly heterosexual community of Formula One, male, white, well-to-do, and heterosexual by and large. And I suppose I'm interested that this book, which I wrote because I wanted to do something completely different, and my mother was a novelist and my grandmother was a novelist, and I had lived through, and luckily lived through rather than died in, the which many of my friends did very sadly, the crisis of HIV/AIDS in the late 80s and early 90s. Of course, HIV is still a big problem, and AIDS is still a big problem in the world. You know, there are 32 million people have died of AIDS in the world, and there are 38 million people living with HIV in the world. And indeed, in sub-Saharan Africa, it remains a big problem, as we know. But in the Western world, by and large, not so much, because of the availability of antiretroviral meds which control it. So prior to their invention, it was a real holocaust among young gay men, particularly. And I worked as a volunteer for London Lighthouse, which was the largest HIV/AIDS centre in the world at the time. And I saw a lot, and in my way, perhaps did my best to help people in their hour of dire need. We're talking about youngsters, men in their 20s, boys in their late teens, dying, sometimes despised and rejected, and often entirely alone. Just imagine that for a second. Just imagine that. And I wanted to honor them with a piece of complete fiction. It is fiction, though of course it draws on my experiences. And I decided to write it, but also I wanted all the proceeds to go to charity. My mother died of cancer in 2013, and so the Bernardine Bishop Appeal, which fundraises for Click Sargent, which is a children's cancer charity, and all proceeds of sales of The Boy Made the Difference, whether it's Kindle or paperback will go to that appeal. So that is why I wrote it. And the interesting thing for me, or particularly for this, taken it to their heart and have tweeted about it and bought it and commented on it. So that's been an interest to me.
And of course, here, in South Africa, AIDS is still a massive, massive problem. So I would love to recommend that, once we get through COVID and coronavirus and travel becomes a little more um, accessible to all of us, I think it would be wonderful for you to come to South Africa and share your book and also your knowledge and your experience of having lived through this scourge of the world. I think that it would be something I think South Africans would greatly embrace.
Well, I would love to do that, of course.
Um, you're
Great,
at Aston Martin
great.
now. How did that come about, Matt?
So I was working for W Series and happy at W Series, and I am very positive about W Series, as I've explained. But it was indicated to me by an intermediary that Lawrence Stroll would like to see me. And I had two quite lengthy meetings with him, actually. And I became completely convinced that this is a man who really means business, who knows and loves the sport, who is the largest single shareholder in Aston Martin Lagonda, who has bought the Racing Point team, as it was, and wants to go racing at the highest level, and not only go racing, but win. And he said he wanted to hire some senior people, and he said he wanted to ask me if I wanted to join the comms operation as Chief Communications Officer. And of course, I just said yes. And I've been at Aston Martin now for 4 months or whatever it is, not long. And we've kicked off the season. We've had a couple of races. We haven't been as fast as we had hoped, but we're working on that. And I've been incredibly impressed by the esprit de corps. Obviously, I knew the team. I knew the team back when it was Jordan. Yeah. And I knew the team when it was Spiker and Midland and Force India and Racing Point. But now I know the same people and newer people and different people now that it's Aston Martin, and I'm proud to be one of them. And I think, I'm not going to predict anything. I'm not going to make any predictions around success in terms of timing, but we will win at some point, because Lawrence Stroll has always won in everything, and he wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see it through, and you can see also just the ethos at Aston Martin looks fantastic. You mentioned, yes, it has been a little bit of a difficult start to the season. How do you, as the communications, the chief communications officer, how do you deal with Otmar, talking to the most probably television press and going off and saying, well, these rules are ridiculous and this has changed and it shouldn't be that way. We can understand the frustration. How do you then sit there and try and sort of pacify it all that all things are actually okay?
Yeah, look, I've got I think Otmar's a great guy. Obviously, I've known him for many, many years. Enormous passion, and the way that he held that team together through difficult times, through the whole Vijay Mallya problem, the Sahara problem, all these problems, he managed to hold it together through sheer force of personality and passion. And there's a lot of love for Otmar within the team, and rightly so. And he and I are getting on great, and I think he is a great guy. So I'm pleased and proud to be his colleague. Yeah, look, it is no secret that we believe, as does Mercedes-Benz, that the fact is, and sometimes these things happen in racing, the fact is that our low rake philosophy of our two cars design has been impacted more heavily by the recent rule changes that were introduced for safety reasons. I'm not going to get into exactly what and why and how and wherefore. All I would say is I think people accept that, and there has been some positive dialogue, and let's leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, I listen. As we all know, in the world of Formula One, whenever there are rule changes, there are always going to be those who are pro and those that are not pro. Matt, the world has changed, and I'm not just talking coronavirus and COVID. The world has changed since the explosion of digital and, of course, social media. And this must be one of the most challenging, I think, parts as being a communication officer, where you're still sending out press releases, yet every fan, or not even a fan, or anybody who's got an opinion becomes a keyboard warrior and says Lance Stroll is only there because of his dad's money. Why is Sebastian Vettel there? He can't drive a car anymore. And I sit there and I'm very sympathetic and empathetic towards racing drivers, because I've also been watching it for 45 years and maybe understand it a little bit more than, I'm not saying the average punter, but a newish kind of a punter. How do you keep your drivers in check, as well as having to read a lot of the crap, unfortunately, that comes out?
Well, interesting question from a number of uh, perspectives. First of all, Lance Stroll is an extremely talented racing driver.
Thank you for saying that.
He really is. I've seen a lot, and I've seen him now, up and close, his racing for a couple of races and a test, and he is extremely talented. So anybody who's making disparaging comments about him in that sense, I think just needs to look a little bit more carefully at the data. He is a very talented racer. He's only 22, by the way, as well. Hopefully he'll be racing for many, many, many more years to come. And everybody improves between 22 and 28, let's say. So I could see him being very successful if we can give him the car. Sebastian Vettel owes nobody any justification. 4-time world champion, 53 Grand Prix wins. I think this year he is getting used to the car by his own admission. Unfortunately, we didn't give him as much mileage as we should have done, if our car had been more reliable in the pre-season test. And don't forget, it was only 3 days, 1.5 days each. So if you have reliability problems, it really does cause you problems, and he did have problems. So to an extent, he's still learning the car. I think we're probably seeing that as well with Fernando Alonso and perhaps even Daniel Ricciardo. There are other drivers who haven't had the immersion that we used to have, when you just hang out in Jerez and Barcelona and Valencia for week upon week, and by the time you got to Melbourne, you knew the car better than the back of your own hand. So I think that's something that we should just wait and see. He is a great driver. He didn't become a bad driver overnight. He's a great driver. As regards controlling social media, well, it's very easy with Seb because he doesn't do any.
Yeah.
He doesn't do any at all. He's decided not to, and he doesn't want to. Lance does, but he's not a prolific tweeter, in the way of some. I suppose in many ways, I learned about having to work with drivers and their social media, most of all with Lewis, because Lewis is a prolific user of social media. And, I used to, when I was at McLaren, I used to check Lewis's social media output every 15 minutes, just in case. and I don't mean that. I'm a huge fan of Lewis and an admirer. I think he's the best driver in the sport, and the best driver in the sport off track too. I very much approve of and respect and applaud the things that he's doing with his platform for the benefit of humankind. That's my opinion. And he's also one of the greatest drivers who's ever raced a Formula One car in the history of the sport. So that's not a bad combination, is it? But particularly a few years ago, he used to give you the odd run around. People would say, oh my goodness, have you seen? He's just tweeted the team's telemetry. Oh my God. Oh my God. But we had all those things, you know, oh, he's just tweeted that Jenson Button has unfollowed me. Has he? Jenson never followed him, actually. Anyway, so there we are. But that's the caveat, is that I have enormous respect and affection for, and admiration for Lewis. But no, I think in those ways, what one learns. I think you know, there's a new young generation of driver. Perhaps Lando Norris is an example of that, who kind of lives his life on social media and on Twitch and gaming and so on and so forth. Sorry, I don't mean to say disparage him by saying he has no other life. What I don't know him well enough to say, although I obviously do know him. But what I mean is that there's a new way of living that the youngsters live, and that we have to keep pace with and respect. And actually, by and large, the fans love it, I think.
I think you hit the nail on the head there with the phrase "keep pace." I think that's spot on. Matt, finally, you mentioned Lewis Hamilton. I want to bring in. We know that this year for most of the teams is very much a, I hate to use the word, a sort of nowhere kind of feeling, because we're all focusing on 2022. I can understand from Aston Martin it is important because you're just brand new back into the sport, and having this rake issue is not exactly what you need. But that's maybe another discussion. Lewis, most of the teams are focusing on 2022, but just after 2 races, we are seeing this wonderful battle, and we've still got a long way to go between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. Red Bull, Honda want to go out in a blaze of glory. Do you think, 2 questions here, do you think this could hinder both Red Bull and Mercedes going into 2022? And the second part is, do you think anybody, including a Max Verstappen in a decent enough car, has the mettle to really take on Lewis to the final race?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm not going to answer the first part, which is whether or not their battle for the championship is going to hinder Mercedes or Red Bull's approach to 2022. And the reason I'm not is that obviously I work for another team, and that's one reason. So it wouldn't be appropriate for me to spout off about them in that sense. And secondly, I am not in possession of the relevant information. I don't know what their development plans are. And you know, a regular journalist would be able to speculate if they wanted to, but that's not my game anymore. So going on to the second point, you know, I'm an inveterate admirer of Lewis Hamilton. I've always said, prior to Lewis Hamilton acquiring the mantle of greatness, which he has, I always said that I couldn't divide 3 drivers as the best of all time from 3 different eras, which were Juan Manuel Fangio, Jim Clark, and Ayrton Senna. And I found it very difficult to divide them. And I now think you have to put Lewis on that. There's now 4 on that podium, not 3. I think he's very much among the greatest we have ever seen. And by the way, if anybody's saying, what about Nuvolari? Yes, of course, and Rosemeyer and others, but I'm talking about Formula One.
Correct.
Which obviously began, the Formula One World Championship began in 1950. There were also great drivers like Rosemeyer and Nuvolari in the 30s. Anyway, to your question, I obviously know Lewis Hamilton very well, and I know Max Verstappen not at all. But he's clearly a fantastic driver. I mean, some of his performances have been stunning, either consummate winning or also brilliant races, particularly in the wet. And he's dominated his teammates in a consistent way, as indeed has Lewis by and large. You know, in his rookie year, he matched, and in fact scored slightly more points than, but matched somebody who had just won not just the last year's World Championship, but the last 2 years' World Championships, Fernando Alonso. And the one person he got beaten by, and I'll probably court controversy here, is Nico Rosberg, who won the World Championship in 2016. And I think Nico Rosberg is very underrated. Anybody who can take on Lewis Hamilton in an equal car and come out ahead. Yes, I know Lewis had some unreliability problems, but to do that, hats off, chapeau to Nico Rosberg. And I think he got criticized because he didn't stay on to defend his crown. But I think he's a very, very underrated Formula One driver. So now, for the season ahead, all I would say is, as far as Aston Martin's concerned, we will continue to improve. As far as the battle for the World Championship is concerned, yes, it does look like it is going to be fought out between those two drivers. We don't know, other things could happen, but it might be fought out between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, and it might be the beginning of a rivalry between the two that may entertain us for years to come. We don't know. Lewis, of course, is 36. How long does he want to continue? Again, I don't know. I think he's as fit as a butcher's dog. I think he could race till he's 40 if he wants to, but only if he wants to. Obviously, Max has got time on his hands. I couldn't possibly tell you who's going to win because nobody knows. So there's no point me alienating half the world by saying something that will annoy them. Because if you say Lewis is going to win, you upset the Max fans. If you say Max is going to win, you upset the Lewis fans. And I don't have any knowledge of it. I'm not being evasive. I have spoken about both of them. And I just hope it's a great championship.
Yeah, I think it will be, and yeah, I look forward to it. I know it's going to be a very, very busy time. Matt, I can't thank you enough for your time. I wish you safe on your travels throughout this crazy, crazy world that we live in now, and the best to Aston Martin. Wonderful to have Aston Martin back in Formula One, and may you guys go from strength to strength. And yeah, if you're free again in the near future, I look forward to chatting to you again.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much.